Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa McGuire, and since we've already been in this class for a few weeks, so I think you already know that, I am the department head and a professor in the Department of Social Work. And I am pleased today to talk with you about some of the dynamics of teams and teamwork, and how we can use the understanding of those dynamics to really achieve a high level of collaborative practice. I'm going to be talking about some of the material that I've regularly provided to different courses over my time in social work. And I'm also using some of the notes that comes from Tim Rupke, who is also a social worker, who's the director of the Fairfield Center. And they do community mediation and conflict resolution. So he's provided some great materials, and I'm going to use many of them as I talk with you today. So the first thing that I'm going to do is show you a picture. And Tim regularly does this in class, and it is a fascinating picture that I think has a lot to say about group work. So as you look at this picture, I'd like you to think about what you are seeing. So you have lots of different people here. What do you think this group is trying to accomplish? And what are the things that might help them be successful? And what are some of the things that might be a barrier for them to accomplish that goal? So just think about those things, jot a few things down, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will have a whole lot more kinds of things than you're able to talk about when you look at a picture like this or think about how a group and how it functions. So some of the material that I really like talking about is small group theory. And a team is certainly one form of a small group. And so that's why this theory is really important. And in my practice as a social worker, both working with therapeutic groups and task groups, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, I have found that understanding these theories has really helped me to be able to lead groups or even be a member of a group and maybe not get quite so frustrated at what is happening and really helping the group move forward. So that's why we're going to spend just a minute. This is probably going to be a long minute in terms of a slide, but talk about some of the very basic things that people have learned about small groups and how they function. So the first is there are different types of groups. And in this case, we are thinking about a task group, because a task group is going to be focused on something that happens out in the environment, wanting to make a change or make things better in the way things function. And so the focus is really on tasks. However, there's another kind of group that lots of people think about when you talk about groups, and that's a therapeutic group. And so those can be support groups, therapy groups, and the purpose of those kinds of groups are to make changes to the individual. So the way to tell the difference is what are you focusing on? What needs to be different? And then where is the focus of that? So therapy versus task groups. Again, a team is one kind of task group. But regardless of whether there's a task group or a therapy group, all groups seem to go through stages in development. And there's lots of different models. People have been talking about these stages of development for a whole long time. And I like this one because the words rhyme and it's really easy to understand. But I think it captures a lot of what happens in small groups. So this goes back to Tuckman and Jensen, 1977. They added on to it a little bit later with the last stage, but it starts out with forming, and that's the beginning of any group. And for you all with your table group, that happened to you the first day of class, right? You came in You probably didn't know anybody. You probably didn't know what that group was all about. And you probably didn't know how you were really going to work together. All of those are questions that get answered during the forming stage. And in a forming stage, there tends to be a lot of agreement. But I would argue that that's kind of superficial agreement because you still don't know the answers to all those questions yet. And so this is what I tend to call forming groups the bobblehead stage because everybody's going, yep, yep, yep. At some point, people begin to grapple with those questions, and sometimes there's not total agreement on that. And in fact, sometimes there's out and out conflict. And so in the Tuckman model, this stage is called the storming phase. And other models of group development call it the conflict stage. But at some point, the group moves from being yes, 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 everything's okay, to wait a minute, what about this, that, and the other thing? And we will talk in a minute how conflict, sometimes we generally have a very negative reaction to conflict. We're trying to avoid conflict. We don't want conflict. It's the symptom of a bad thing. If you see that on these stages of group development, storming is a natural, normal, and I would add necessary part of group development. Because if groups all just do the bobblehead and say, yeah, 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 that's really what we call groupthink, where people are not thinking for themselves. Everybody's just going along, not really questioning, not using critical thinking, not looking at outside perspectives, all of which can be very damaging to group outcomes in the long run. So storming happens. It doesn't have to mean out and out warfare in your group. People don't have to be punching each other or screaming at each other. But there begins to be this subtle difference of when you're not really willing to question somebody in forming. In storming, you're going to begin to ask questions, begin to try to put forth some different perspectives and be able to disagree with each other. And that's what leads to the next stage, which is actually norming. And in a norming phase, we begin to figure out how is it that we are going to work together? How are we going to be able to disagree with each other and not have it be a negative experience and really trust each other to know that we're doing this for the good of the group. We're not trying to tear people down and their ideas, but we do need to look at different perspectives. So norming, and you'll see a little bit later on the list, norms, groups develop norms of how to work together. And that can look very different for every group that you're in. You figure out the ways that are going to work for this group. Once you've been able to get through forming, storming, and norming, you are able to get to the phase where the work actually happens, and that's called the performing phase. This is often a very pleasurable time. You're feeling good, you're accomplishing the task that needs to be done, and it can be a very positive phase. But unfortunately, sometimes groups haven't done a good job in the forming, storming, norming phases, and so therefore they're really kind of hobbled when they try to do the performing. So sometimes it's important for you to have to go back, circle back through, and although we're talking about this in a very linear way, like step 1, step 2, step 3, in reality, there's a lot more of the cycling back. The processes are all there. And frankly, I think they kind of do happen in this way, but there's a lot more cycling back than people, I think, realize. And then, of course, the final phase that was added in a little bit later is adjourning, and that's the ending phase. And there are certain things that have to happen in that phase. The two of them are evaluating how it went. Did we meet our goals? Did we do the best we could? And then also celebrating what you were able to accomplish. Both of those things are very important in the adjourning phase. So hopefully in this class, in your table groups, you will see examples of all 4 of those areas. And those dynamics happen in any team that you're involved in. It's just part of the theory. We also know that people take on different roles when they are in a group, and some of this has to do with your personality. Some of you may be more of a task-focused person. Another word that's used in the literature for that task focus is instrumental. But task-focused people like to get things done. They like things to be structured. They like to move in a sequential way. They want to make sure people know and understand what their responsibilities are. And so these are important functions, and we couldn't reach our goals for a task group if we didn't have task-oriented kinds of people. However, it's really important to note that that is not the only kind of role there is, and that's not the only role that's important to good group functioning. There's another group of roles that have to do with the process of the group and what happens. These are also known as the socio-emotional roles. So these are the folks in the group that want to make sure that everybody is able to participate, that everybody's feeling good about a situation, maybe about a decision that you're coming to. They're caring about the process of making some decisions just as much of the task of getting the decision done. In a well-functioning group or team, you want to have a mix of people who tend to do the task roles and tend to do the process roles. Now, sometimes your own personality makes you lean toward one or the other. When I just described the two, did the idea of being a task person resonate more with you, or the process person resonate more with you? That's based on your personality. Some of you may be saying, I do both of those things, and that's great. But I think what you want to do is think about the group and the people who are in your group or team, and see if you don't have a good balance between the task folks that get us going, help us to get to the goal, keep us focused, and the process people who really think about what is happening along the way. And again, for optimal group functioning, you want to have a little bit of both. And you might need to take on different roles based on the group. So if you're in a group with a lot of task-oriented people, you may have to take on the process-oriented roles, and vice versa. If you have a lot of process-oriented people that do a lot of discussing and checking in with people, you might have to be the one that says, okay, guys, we got to get to the task at hand here. So your own ability to function in a group may go back and forth a little bit. I talked briefly about norms in the norming discussion, but every group sets some norms for themselves. Some of these norms are automatic, that, for example, we don't interrupt people, or we don't call people names. Things like that are basic social norms. The problem with those kind of basic norms is that just because you think they are basic social norms doesn't mean that everybody else does. So sometimes these norms are unspoken, and we think that everybody holds the same norms that we do, which is often not the case. Sometimes when you're in a group, it's really helpful to do group rules. How do we want to function with each other? I do this a lot with children's groups that I work on. They like to write them up on the board on a piece of paper, or I usually do that, so we have them. And usually I have the group come up with those norms or rules. And so how are we going to work together? And what are those norms going to be? If they're unspoken, those are usually considered informal norms. Spoken formal norms are rules or things like that. It is almost always an excellent idea to have a discussion early on about what are the rules of this group. How are we going to work with each other? And hopefully, if you haven't already done that, today might be a great day to talk about that. Because if people are holding these informal norms, that they think everybody should be following, but not everybody does or feels like those are important, that's the recipe for conflict. And so often that's why the storming process comes first and then setting those norms. It just happens in kind of in a circle. Group cohesion is also important, something you hear about. That is quite literally the attractiveness of the group. What attracts you to be a part of and increase your participation in this group. For this class, for example, you know that you kind of have to be in the group to get credit for the class, right? So there's some of those intrinsic things that make that build group cohesion. But if it's not a positive experience, and if you're not moving through those stages of group development and being able to set those norms and feel like you're being successful, you're going to have a lower group cohesion. So those norms and setting and discussing those norms really can lead to increased group cohesion. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about on this slide, I know it's really long, is the idea of leadership. And leadership is so important in so many ways, but in teams particularly. In the literature, there's 3 classic kinds of group leadership. One is authoritarian. This is what I call my way or the highway. We do things my way because I am the leader of the group. And there are some positives to that way of doing a group. Often authoritarian groups tend to move a little more quickly to accomplish tasks because they're more structured, and people like structure. But people also don't like to be told what to do. And so sometimes those groups, people can rebel, or they don't always consider all the options. So they may make a decision and finish the group, whatever needed to happen, but it may not be the best solution because there wasn't a lot of ability to listen to diverse perspectives. Another form of group is laissez-faire, or leadership is laissez-faire. This is where the leader doesn't do much, doesn't take a lot of role, kind of lets things go. And actually, this is the least effective kind of group leadership. People, as I said before, really do need some structure. And with laissez-faire, sometimes groups just fall apart and are not able to accomplish their goals. So the type of group leadership that is most effective in most situations is authoritative, where there's sort of a balance between the leader of the group providing structure and keeping things moving in a task role capacity, but also is able to listen and be open to other kinds of information. So those are just some basic ideas to help you think about groups and teams as small group as you're moving through your process. So this next slide has to do with the ways that we might think about experiences with groups. And a lot of times if I ask people in class, what has been their experience in working with small groups in a class, I get lots of these categories that are on this side of the screen, that people have felt like the groups weren't very successful. They were unsuccessful. And there are emotional reactions to being in a group that feels unsuccessful. There are physiological, actually in your body, about an unsuccessful group experience, and then relational. So my guess is all of you have had at some point in your academic career an unsuccessful group experience. So you should know what many of these things feel like. Clearly negative. But then we do have times when you've been in positive group situations. And again, they are There are emotional reactions to that, there are physiological reactions to that, and relational aspects. These positive kinds of experience are clearly what we want to strive for. And it is my proposition that by knowing and understanding much more about group or team dynamics, we maximize the opportunities to have successful experiences and we minimize the opportunities for unsuccessful groups. But regardless, working in a group or team is a challenge because of conflict. We talked about it being part of the stages of group development. Many of us, if you can think for just a minute, when you see the word conflict, what are your own emotional reactions to that? How do you react physiologically to conflict? How do you react in relationships when there is conflict? It's a whole field of science. It's challenging. This is not an easy thing. And yet the one thing that I can probably get all of us to agree on is that conflict is normal. It is a part of being a person. We don't see eye to eye. And unfortunately, for the most part as a society, we've conceptualized this as a negative thing, when in reality, the fact that you and I may have very different experiences, most of you are quite a bit younger than I am, and we're going to see the world a little bit differently. And there is lots to be learned from each other and seeing different perspectives, which can lead to serious conflict, or it can really lead to learning. So we want to make sure that we're having the positive benefits of conflict and not the negative. But there is a cost to this. And if you're thinking about the workplace, there are direct costs, lost wages and fees, productivity. If we're spending all our time managing conflict, we can't really do our job, right? Continuity costs, we lose relationships. And then we have our own emotional costs where we're angry, we have fear, it's stressful. And you can imagine in a medical or a health situation, all of these things can spill over and limit our ability to provide excellent service, no matter what kind of practice you do and how good you are at it. If we're wasting our time on the negative aspects of conflict, we're not providing our patients and clients the best service that is available to them. But as I mentioned, there is this other side of conflict, that it is a powerful and a necessary force in the creation of ideas, novel solutions, and group energy. It does not have to create problems and increase costs, but it's our unwillingness and our inability to manage conflict that really gets in the way. And so that's part of the reason why we're talking about this in this IPE class, is because we know conflict is normal, it's natural, it's gonna happen. And we want to see if we can prepare you, if you're going to be working interprofessionally, to be able to know a little bit about this and try to manage it to get the positive benefits. So this is also really related to communication. This is one of the core competencies, like teamwork is another one, for interprofessional practice. And we always have to keep in mind that communication has so much to do with your perspective. What you are looking at, what you are seeing, what your own profession has socialized you to see and look at, may be very different than some other people. And again, some of this is based on our own life experiences, some of it's based on our professional experiences, but again, it's natural and your perspective is going to make a difference. So what do? We have to have good listening. And so you can't just say, but I see it differently because I'm a social worker, but I see it differently because I've been in practice for 30 years. It is really important that we learn excellent listening skills, and that despite all those buts, we listen anyway. So even when there are listening blocks, there's lots of different perspectives. There's lots going on in our lives, right? When IPE is only going to be part of what we are doing on a daily basis. So we need to get really good at doing these listening skills. We need to be provide the word here is reassuring attitude to make people relax so that they can really tell us their stories. It's hard sometimes for people to tell their full story, especially when there's pain and trauma and challenges involved, other people who haven't listened before or haven't understood. So this attitude and how we face listening is important. We need to learn to convey empathy, respect, and acceptance, regardless of diverse beliefs. We don't have to agree with everybody. And in fact, we will work with patients who have very different values and culture than our own. But that does not mean we still can't be a good listener and convey empathy, respect, and acceptance. We need to learn to summarize perspectives, feelings, and issues to make sure that we're hearing things correctly. And we need to learn how to state clearly the basic problems and issues before moving forward. So these are some basic listening skills that I think will be very helpful. It is also a decision to be consciously present. So we have to set aside our mind chatter. We need to develop skills to be able to paraphrase what people are telling us. It seems like you felt angry when such and such happened. We need to think about and structure speaking and listening, back to ground rules, setting norms. Sometimes groups use a talking stick. I don't know that people would do that in a health setting, but we need to learn to make sure that we're hearing everyone at the table. One of the things that in this class we've talked about before, and because I'm taping this before class, I don't know if we've said it, but I'm going to say it anyway. We've talked about the importance of the empty chair in a discussion. So we can say all of our perspectives in our group, but we can also think about who is not here, whose voice are we missing, and what might they say if they're here to be able to increase all of our listening. We're going to talk about some other ways to help make decisions, straw polling, and again, keep listening. Another thing that's really important is that we are able to separate people from the problems. This sounds so like obvious, but it's not so easy when you get into real life and practice. You're not going to like everybody. Some people you're going to maybe dislike, but that doesn't mean that you cannot work with them if they're part of an interprofessional team that you're dealing with. And so you have to be able to separate your personal feelings about a person from what the issue is at hand. So that's something to think about and to have awareness of in yourself to be able to make that separation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what Tim has brought forth. He has used a model of Sam Kaner from 2007, and you'll see lots of these little different figures about how decision making works. And Tim really likes this material. I really like it too. I think it provides some pictures of what we need to do in the decision making process. So here's a schemata of what it basically looks like. We have a new topic or issue or problem. We have people, we have these ideas, people are thinking about different things. We have some different ideas here, then we keep thinking about those ideas, and then we make a decision. Seems simple, right? No, not so much. So what we want to begin to do is see the decision making as a process, and that there are steps in this process. Again, different models use different words, but basically most of the models say the same thing. The first thing that we have to do when we're looking at a problem or a challenge or something we have to make a decision about is that we have to know what it is that we're doing. And you would be surprised that in a group, sometimes people think this is what we're doing, whereas somebody else thinks this is what we're doing. So you always want to start out by clarifying what the problem, what decision needs to be made. And it can be as simple as a little sentence. A couple weeks ago, I think you all made a decision about what your topic would be. And at the beginning of that discussion, it's really easy for a group leader, team leader to say, so right now we need to make a decision on what topic we'd like to do for our presentation. Again, that's not rocket science, right? But you would be surprised how many times people skip this step thinking, oh, everybody knows. And sometimes they don't. Then the second step also sometimes gets skipped, is that we don't want to rush to make a decision too soon. We really want to embrace a brainstorming process to get lots of different ideas and options on the table. Because when we move too quickly to making that decision, we sometimes miss some really important things. And so a good group leader is always going to make sure we spend a little bit of time on brainstorming different solutions. So again, I'll use the example of you choosing your topics. I hope you engaged in some kind of a way to hear maybe what each person in your group really liked, and make sure you heard from every person. You might have just thought, talked about in general the different things we've talked about in the class and that you were interested in, which would make these certain topics be of interest to you. So that's a really good process. Then once you have the ideas, the possibilities on the table, you begin to analyze and evaluate the options. One of the things that I've encouraged students to do when they're making a decision on this is to think about their interests. Of course, what do you like? What are you interested in doing? What do you have experience with? Versus what you might like to learn more about. This is an opportunity to maybe think about something you hadn't thought that much about. And one of the options that I encourage groups to think about as they're making this decision, maybe I said this to you last week when you were making the decision, is what area is going to have some good literature to support you? Because we do ask for you to get the literature. And frankly, some of that we have done by if you choose one of the Healthy People, I think we're maybe doing the 2030 goals this year, which is great with this group. If there's an issue that I know is going to be really hard for you to find literature on, I actually won't let you do that group because I know it will make it really hard for you, and nobody wants it to be harder. But that's something that people don't often think about. What is going to be, what's out there in the literature? And you guys all use your phones and your computers really easily. You can do a really quick lit search and see what's out there just as a beginning, which is going to make this project easier for you. Then again, that can also be considered part of formulating and testing alternative strategies. And so you want to, again, what we're trying to do is not make that decision too quickly until step 5. And that's when you decide and implement that decision, and then of course evaluating that decision. So like I said, these 6 steps, different processes call them different things, but the issue is usually trying to jump too quickly to number 5 without fully going through these other steps in the process. So what it really looks like, not that nice, sweet, straight lines, is this schematic that talks about the topic. When we start out, we're going to be saying different things. We're going to have some different opinions. We may even disagree with some people. They may really want to work with older adults, and you are like, oh, that is just not the topic that I'm interested in. And that's okay. So this first part of the decision-making process really helps you see the divergence in your thinking, divergent thinking, And then hopefully at some point in the middle, you move to convergent thinking when you're narrowing things down, evaluating, and coming to a decision. That's a really idealized way of looking at it. So familiar options, we get some diverse perspectives, we discuss, we refine, we make a decision. This is very, very much what it's supposed to look like. Oh, I don't know what that is. We're going to skip that slide. Oh, here it is. So divergent thinking, just so you know, includes generating alternatives, a free-for-all open discussion, just talking about what you're interested in, gathering diverse points of view, and unpacking the logic. What is it going to mean if? If we do this, what happens next? Then when you're beginning into the convergent thinking, you are evaluating alternatives, summarizing the key points, putting things into categories, and arriving at the general decision. Unfortunately, what happens more often than not is we get into the divergent thinking, and then it just feels like, to some people, especially you task people out there, of which I am one, we're wasting time. We just need to make this decision and move forward. The process people may be like, we're stuck. Nobody agrees on this. Everybody's unhappy. But sometimes we get stuck, and even in higher level places, unfortunately, this happens much more than we would like to think about it, and nothing happens. So this is the example that I gave earlier of making a decision too soon. We didn't allow the process to come back to the convergent thinking and make truly a good decision, a well thought through decision. So I love it that Tim talks about this all the time, this place in the middle when we've got the divergent thinking, but we haven't been able to quite get to the convergent thinking, is called the groan zone. And so as a group leader, you often want to be on the lookout for the groan zone. When have you entered it? People are getting fidgety. Some people are saying, we just need to make a decision. That would sometimes be me. Other people are like, it just feels like we're never going to all come to a good decision here. This is where you really need to use your skills and help people realize what's happening. So how do we make that decision? How do we come to some of these decisions? If we're amazingly lucky, we can have unanimous agreement or consensus, and so that's okay. We might do a vote. We might say the majority rules, right? If you're an authoritarian, we might have the person in charge says, okay, I heard what you said. I think we should do this. We're doing this. Again, not my favorite way of doing things. Flip a coin. Depending on the decision, may or may not work. We might make a committee and have a delegation make that decision for us and bring it back. Or we might have a person in charge that, again, in an authoritarian way, doesn't even enter any decision or any discussion and says, we're going to do our group presentation on sleep disorders. Again, you can imagine some of these things are certainly more effective than others. One way that Tim suggests and uses regularly is trying to figure out consensus and strength of support, because this is usually not just a yes-no kind of decision. And so this is a way of helping people figure it out. A 5 is endorse, fully agree, I'm 100% on board with that. 1 is a block this veto or veto this idea, I don't want to deal with it, I can't do that. So then we have people who say a 4, I agree, it's okay, don't love it, don't hate it. And then down here on the other hand, we have a 2, don't like it, but again, I'll live with it. I'm not going to block it. And then in the middle, we have the people with mixed decisions. So anytime you're looking at a big decision, you might want to do some of what is called straw polling. And so you have these 5 areas, and these are the different ways, different ideas that people look at. So in this first one, you have mixed, agree, endorse. This sounds pretty good. I think you could go with this one. On this one, it's still strong, endorse, agree, mixed, but you do have the veto. And if you're going to be, follow your own rules, you got to say, that one's not going to work. And then you have this one that's sort of in the middle. Mixed is the highest, agree 4, don't like 4. This is another one that you might want to take back and try to find some other ideas to see if you can get closer to the first idea that we looked at. But you can see how straw polling makes it a little bit easier to get a better sense rather than just say yes or no, or up or down. Oh, and the last one, 6, 1, 2. So a lot of agreement, but you've got 2 people who really don't like it. I'd like to see a better option if that was me. But you've got, you also have 5 up here endorsing. So again, there's no easy answers with figuring out some of these alternatives. And again, back to this idea of people who are task focused and people who are process focused. You're always going to have some people who want to really think about the process. And for good group functioning, that process is just as important as your final outcome. The ways that you do that is you begin to build relationships through introduction and group rules. I talked about those things in the stages of group development. These things create an environment for success, and they also help us figure out how to encourage divergent views and disagreement so that we can use conflict effectively. We can manage it in service of good group decisions. We want to encourage people to do information sharing, making sure we're listening, paraphrasing, really hearing different people in our groups. We want to make sure we clarify the issue at hand and are able to know what it is that we're doing, and so that we can move forward. We're going to find out lots of different options. What are the different things that we can do here? And then come to some closure to negotiate a mutually agreeable resolution. This is a great slide. This says how we really want it to happen. Hopefully we've given you some ideas to help get you there in working together as a team. If you have questions, I'm not quite sure how we're doing this, so you're always able to email me and ask me questions about group and team process. I would love, it's one thing I really like talking about and thinking about, so please feel free. And again, I want to give a shout out to Tim Rupke from the Fairfield Center, and he always provides his email in case you have questions for him as well. So there we go. That is a really quick, although 42 minutes, it's pretty long, trip through group dynamics and managing conflict for teams. Thank you. Bye-bye.